what exactly should the region, perhaps the rest of the world, take away from Maduro's ouster? Excuse me. Well, it's actually very disconcerting if I'm sitting in a foreign capital, right? We just saw the United States release a national security strategy proclaiming that it was going to break from prior practice. It was going to be more judicious in the use of force and the application of American power. And instead, here we are a month later, watching the United States oust Maduro under very thin pretenses, using an exemplary use of force itself, but a very thin pretext, and threatening his successor unless they play ball with the United States. So if I'm sitting in the rest of the world, I'm very nervous. I'm worried that the United States is in fact going to be even more reckless under the Trump administration going forward, more inclined to use force than even prior administrations.
So just building kind of on what Josh said, the next steps of that we've seen this extensive use of force, and the question is obviously what comes next. Unfortunately, we've learned that using military force to affect political transitions is immensely challenging, and it often makes things worse. The recent U.S. failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, hardly rare in the history of military intervention, have left in their wake long periods of instability and human suffering. Unfortunately, this is because outside interveners are rarely treated as liberators, and such attempts to restructure nations often occur because the nations are facing intractable political and social challenges. This is what we've seen in Venezuela. It's home to a divided society with low levels of trust, high levels of corruption, and a great deal of competition across the entire country. The United States is wading into this sort of environment and becoming another actor in the game, as it were. And unfortunately, our long-term understanding of how this is going to work out isn't good, it's costly, and it has immense human costs involved.
I've been thinking a little bit about the question of how this operation might affect U.S. relations with the rest of the region. And on the one hand, we've seen that some governments, especially right of center governments, have really expressed relief after this ouster of President Maduro. But most of the leaders in the region in Latin America have denounced the ouster of Maduro as a violation of international law. And despite Maduro's unpopularity, the White House's seeming return to this form of gumbo diplomacy really touches a sensitive nerve for the region. It's a region in which the US has intervened militarily on numerous occasions. And the Trump administration's revival of the Monroe Doctrine had already raised concerns with this national security strategy document. But now the ouster of Maduro really sends a strong signal that the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine will have teeth. So the events in Venezuela should be extremely concerning for places like Colombia, Mexico, Cuba in particular. And in Colombia, for example, left of center President Gustavo Petro, who's a former Marxist guerrilla, has previously clashed with President Trump and has been quite forceful in his condemnation of the US incursion in Venezuela. Now, because of Colombia's role in the production of drugs in the Andean region, the White House can look to advance this narco-terrorism justification to intervene in that country. And President Trump has said that much. The same logic would apply to Mexico, which remains a major supplier of drugs to the United States. And even though President Sheinbaum has maintained a relatively good working relationship with President Trump, he has made the point to characterize Mexico as currently being run by drug cartels, and has warned that the southern neighbor could be next. So Colombia, Mexico, and that sort of narco-terrorist logic. And Cuba may not be lumped in that same category, but Maduro's ouster really represents a major blow for the island's economy, which had become dependent on subsidized Venezuelan oil. And President Trump may leverage this deteriorating and already dire economic condition in Cuba to try to effect regime change. In fact, the White House has expressed that Cuba, there's no need for regime change, or at least US-led regime change in Cuba, because the regime is so fragile that it'll probably just collapse on its own. So mixed reactions in the region, but certainly very concerning from the perspective of international law and just the US return to gumbo diplomacy.
Yeah, just adding on to that, if we kind of compare it together, thinking through this, what the day after looks like in the context of Cuba, what we've just observed over the last few days makes the preparation for the Iraq invasion in 2003 look robust and comprehensive.
Yeah.
The US government spent a lot of time preparing for that. Whether or not we followed this advice, there was a lot of thought of it. In the case of this intervention, there's no evidence that there was any congressional debate, any intragovernmental conversation, or any sort of international dialogue that brought development agencies in other states together. So we really have no meaningful understanding of what the strategic goals of this intervention are and how we are supposed to get there, what success would look like, right? And what success would look like in Cuba or Colombia or something like this. We're really in kind of uncharted territory, and it's not clear what the policy process was leading up to this.
And let me just pile on because I think we should also be thinking about the regional consequences. And Gustavo and Alec both cued to this a little bit, but I also want to point out the international politics aspects of all this because you, a charitable reading of this operation would be that this is an effort by the United States to remind countries in the region that it, the United States, has long sought and will now maintain its dominance of the Western Hemisphere. I think that's not necessarily an important goal for the United States, but it is a possible interpretation of the situation. The problem is, we've now given states across the region, and Gustavo highlighted Cuba, Colombia, and others, real incentive to hedge their bets against the United States, to try to build up their own abilities to check the United States' ambitions, and perhaps even seek external patrons like China and Russia to hedge against American largesse. So, if this was indeed an operation designed to showcase a turn to the Western Hemisphere and assertion of the Monroe Doctrine, this can actually be very self-defeating because of the broader strategic environment the United States is now operating in and what that means for the region.
Josh, how does this change or lead to changes in conversations around European and US support for Ukraine, and as you alluded to it as well, to Russia's potential standing in the global order?
Well, a couple. It's a good question. There are a couple of different aspects of it. Number one, the EU has been very quiet on the operation. It's in fact kind of just said we're going to monitor the situation. And I think that reflects the Europeans' broader concern that the United States, having backed away a little bit from the Russia-Ukraine war, is also seeking to back away from European security. They don't want to give the US any other reason to begin reducing its presence in Europe. But by taking a backseat role and at the same time encouraging countries of the Western Hemisphere to hedge against the United States, it's creating diplomatic political openings for countries like Russia, countries like China. And I think going forward, we're actually going to see a more complicated geopolitical chessboard come as a result. Because if I'm Lula in Brazil or if I'm sitting in Colombia or Cuba, I'm deeply worried about the future of American unilateralism and will take almost any step and cast my lot in with almost anyone to hedge against American ambitions.
Something that you both highlighted and I want to pick up on is sort of the degree to which there was planning for the next stage. And I certainly can understand why the government would not share a lot of details before or during the operation. But I think the lack of information about the next phase has been, it has raised some eyebrows. And the decapitation of Venezuela's government without this additional dismantling of the Chavista state has really puzzled many observers. And while the White House has advanced law enforcement logic, again using this sort of narco-terrorist argument to bring Maduro to federal court to face these drug trafficking charges, I think leaving the rest of the Venezuelan state in place, leaving top government officials, leaving the armed forces of this whole security apparatus, is truly puzzling, and it's very likely to leave corruption intact. It's unlikely to allow for an opening in terms of democratic transition. So it's something that I'm still trying to grapple with, and on the one hand, by allowing Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who's a Maduro loyalist, to become the president, I think the U.S. has disappointed many Venezuelans and many people around the world who are hoping for the arrival of this opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, Nobel Prize recipient, or maybe not her, but someone associated with the opposition. The former presidential candidate who is currently in exile, Edmundo González Urrutia, someone like himself to occupy the presidency. And instead, Rodriguez has now received the public backing of Venezuela's armed forces, who are the same armed forces that were in place before. And this, I think, gives the new president, President Rodriguez, quite a bit of room for maneuver. And it really undermines sort of the prospects of a true transition to democracy. I should also say that the Trump administration currently, the statements don't seem to put a lot of stock on the importance of that transition, but rather they have been focusing on the importance of the supply of oil for the US strategic purposes. But given how spectacular the show of force by the US and the use of military intelligence to carry out the operation, and the failure of the Venezuelan armed forces to anticipate or repel this attack, I think the new government will likely cooperate with the White House to some extent, but it's much short from what a lot of observers were hoping to see after this intervention in terms of the next steps for Venezuela.
You know, connect.
Yeah.
It's a really good point, Gustavo, and connecting a little bit to the post-war planning that Alec was alluding to. One way to read the lack of a follow-on plan for the Venezuela operation is the hope by the Trump administration that they could do a deal and work through now acting President Rodriguez, which of course, would lower the burden on the United States of governing, quote unquote, Venezuela. The problem is, and I think we all know this, by keeping the regime intact, by keeping the same corruption intact, and by keeping people who now have to appease domestic constituents who are not happy with Maduro's ouster, and at the same time they're trying to appease the United States, the U.S. is actually leaving itself exposed to all sorts of cheating and backroom dealing by the rump Venezuelan government. So even if the administration hoped to avoid paying the cost of running Venezuela, it actually has opened itself up to a bit of a quagmire by having unloyal subordinates, so to speak, on the ground in Venezuela.
Yeah, and I mean, just to build on this as well, too, Gustavo, you mentioned kind of the failure of the Venezuelan military, and that's well taken in this particular operation. But my understanding is this is a sprawling and large security apparatus that is going to spend the next few months entrenching its capabilities locally, both informally through the military, but informally through paramilitary actors as well too. And we're kind of leaving the door open for them to solidify their rule rather than vice versa, while at the same time, as you alluded to, kind of pushing the opposition away and not creating bridges in which the opposition would be empowered, but in fact setting up a context in which the state is going to do everything in their power to maintain their security dominance, and also to push the opposition further out of the way, particularly if they're getting the green light from the Trump administration to do this, as long as they're delivering, as you alluded to, on oil and other demands like this.
Not non sequitur. Gustavo, do you want us to pose a question to you about the possibility this was a bit of an inside job?
Uh, sure. I'll share my thoughts on that, although there's so little information and is
Yeah.
it's really difficult to know. But I think the way that the operation was conducted, I think these types of operations really require someone on the ground in the close circle of power to be guiding the operation in preparation and even real time. And at least there are some reports in the media that that was the case, that someone was real time guiding the special forces as they were descending on the presidential, mansion and on Maduro and his wife, that they were real time telling them where he was and how things were unfolding. So I think the U.S. has really invested in infiltrating the Maduro circles, and it showed in this operation. I think that because of the nature of these types of authoritarian regimes, I think the Venezuelan regime, certainly with Chavez, but now with Maduro, very sort of personality driven, right? Sort of there's the head of the government, and whatever the head of the government wants, it's everyone sort of aligns behind that vision. But institutionally, there isn't a lot of strength. There isn't a lot of growth. These regimes tend to, once the head of the government is ousted, a lot of them collapse spectacularly, like we saw with Gaddafi. It sounds like in this case, it's not quite like that. But I think the armed forces, we've had some members of some leaders, members of the armed forces that have been around for quite some time, and that they have they're a real source of power in the military base. And it'll be really important to have them on board for whatever project the US has in mind for Venezuela. Otherwise, I think it'll be very difficult to carry out. You know, I was reading a little bit about the role of sort of what message this sends to China, right? And what other countries, certainly China, Iran, but let's take China and Russia, and what whether they say, you know, I think Josh, you mentioned that this would, it sends a message to countries in the region that they really need to you know, just be very wary of U.S. involvement and really sort of double down on this anti-U.S. path. But for powers elsewhere, you know, for China and Russia, how might they be interpreting these events?
Well, obviously, none of us have insight into what goes through the minds of those in Beijing or in the Kremlin. So guessing what other countries like China and Russia interpret coming out of this is always a fraught exercise. But being an academic, I'm willing to gamble on the exercise. So there's been a lot of speculation that this operation might do one of two things. Either it will send a message to other countries like China and Russia that the US is invested in stopping their influence. You know, again, part of the narrative for the operation was that this was an assertion of American dominance in the Western Hemisphere to stop foreign powers from intervening. And the other interpretation is that this somehow creates a precedent that other countries will use to justify their own foreign interventions. Now, on the first one, I actually think, for reasons I alluded to earlier, that the risk is actually just the opposite. That by virtue of asserting American power and making other countries around in the region and around the world cherry over American power, we're inviting them to seek Chinese, Russian, and backing by other countries. So I think it actually has the opposite effect. Kind of how, you know, acting against Russia in Ukraine doesn't actually have any deterrent benefits vis-a-vis Taiwan. This is just the nature of international politics. The carry-on effects tend not to be large. But on the possibility that this creates a precedent that other countries will use, at least rhetorically, you know, I think the rhetoric is quite real. You know, when Russia intervened in Ukraine, it very openly referenced the Kosovo operation that the U.S. conducted in 1999. And I think similarly, we're going to see China, Russia, and others not so much act because of Venezuela, but point to the Venezuela operation and saying, look, if the US can violate international law and violate sovereignty, then so too, when our interests dictate it, can we. And so it creates a legitimation device for that they can use. And they may have acted under for their own reasons otherwise, but it also therefore makes it easier for them to justify their actions and makes it harder in turn for the US to say, no, 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 other countries ought for normative or for moral reasons to join with us in opposing Russian or Chinese or Iranian behavior. So the legitimation effects are somewhat there, and I think too there are broader fallout consequences that make it harder for the U.S. to mobilize coalitions when its own interests dictate.
Yeah, just to add on to a very specific example of this, I think that this operation in the United States is part of this long developing pattern since September 11th of kind of the increasing use of special operations forces to do things that are at the real middle or real meeting point of politics and military sort of outcomes. This is something that we probably wouldn't have considered quite like this relatively recently, but the United States has clearly demonstrated that it has the capability and willingness to use special operations forces to intervene in another country, and some would say kidnap the leader of another country. And so I think what this does, as Josh alludes to in this very specific point, is legitimates a lot of Russia's use of what it calls hybrid warfare, of using these kind of tactics that look a little bit unkept at the international level, right? But Russia continues to do them. This is adding a great deal of credence to this, and perhaps it's opening the door for actors like Russia and China to use capabilities that they have, which we don't know exactly, but are similar to ours in terms of these special operations forces, to do things like this at the international level and have both a basis to do that and point to the United States example of doing this. This is pretty flagrant, right, in terms of use as a rhetorical tool for carrying out pretty far-ranging and invasive operations that Russia and China might have in their back pocket, and Russia has already demonstrated its willingness to do things like this in the last decade.
I just want to piggyback on a point Alec raised about the use of special forces in this case, because when you understand the broader context of the operation is also very disconcerting from how the United States tries to go about influencing the politics of other countries. There have been a number of media reports since the operation against Maduro went down that the United States attempted to strike a deal with Maduro to get him to leave the country for a gilded retirement in all sorts of parts of the world, and he just refused. In other words, the US under the Trump administration has tried very hard to say, oh, I can cut a deal, I can use economics, I can use bribery in some cases to get the outcomes that I seek. This actually reveals the limits of that approach in international players, the limits of economic bargaining, the limits of personal bargaining as well. And the fact that the US turned to the sword as opposed to other diplomatic tools or other economic tools or other uh, institutional tools also suggests that as international politics becomes more complicated in the years ahead, as great power politics resume, the U.S. may be more, not less likely to use force in certain parts of the world, especially if we think it can, if U.S. leaders think they can do so quickly and cheaply.
Yeah, this is proof of concept that we have the toolkit to do these sorts of things, right? And it worked in a pretty real and concrete operation.
It sounds like folks in Greenland were fairly alarmed after this,
Yeah.
and I would think one can't blame them. But uh, do we do? Is your sense that, let's say, Russia or China were impressed, or is this, well, yeah, the U.S. can do it, we can too. That's just, in Venezuela, who couldn't, sort of what might be the reaction in terms of that? Because I think the Trump administration has been fairly confident in stating that this has had just such a demonstration effect to show our adversaries how powerful the U.S. military, U.S. intelligence apparatus is. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about this. I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, I think that this is, as Josh alluded way at the beginning of the conversation, this is a pretty impressive military operation. On the other hand, it's not as though Venezuela has a particularly strong air defense system. It's not as though they are a peer competitor to the United States as well, too. I think both Russia and China have demonstrated operations that look like this at a smaller scale. So I mean, to me, I think your point about Greenland is well taken. To me, this looks more like kind of crumbling of the walls of the U.S. willingness to use these sorts of forces and these sorts of kinetic kind of options in a wider set of areas. And I think that might be worrisome to me if I'm somebody in Russia in particular, the U.S. willingness to do this. On the other hand, I don't see this as kind of a game changer and demonstrating a new capability that's particularly advanced from other peer competitors that we have. But I mean, I agree. It's a pretty important question to understand what China thinks of this. The one other piece I'll add to this is that there are U.S. defense analysts that are pretty negative on Chinese special operations forces and think they talk a big game and don't have a lot of content to it. And so, if that sort of hypothesis is true, right, this does look like a pretty big delta that they've suddenly, no pun intended, that they've suddenly kind of run into in terms of looking what they can do versus what we can do. But I'm inclined to think it's more the former. This isn't a game changer. The game changer is the U.S. willingness to use these types of tools in a circumstance like this to so quickly move, as Josh said, from diplomacy to the use of kind of targeted special operations.
Yeah, I think this is less a demonstration of American capabilities in the eyes of Russia and China. And for the reasons Alec alluded to, also, this is in some ways the American backyard. We have very secure bases, we have lots of access to the area. So it's not really evidence of what the U.S. could do in other parts of the world necessarily. Just as, Moscow and Beijing have long had a healthy respect for American military prowess. I think the real danger here is A, it sends a signal to Russia and China that the U.S. May be reckless enough to use force under a variety of circumstances. And as a result, B, can't always be trusted to avoid using force when it says it's not going to use force. Again, this was a bit of a bolt out of the blue of an operation, which means if I'm sitting in Moscow, I'm sitting in Beijing, I'm both concerned that the U.S. is more willing to use force and also that it will stick to its word in a diplomatic deal going forward.
I saw reports. I don't know if this is true or not, but there's a video of Maduro dancing
Yeah.
and, sort of in a way trying, I don't know if he's mocking necessarily on purpose, or if he's coming across as mocking sort of the US efforts to get him to step aside. And this video allegedly is something that the Trump administration saw and really left an impact or made an impact and prompted, sort of an operation. I don't know if that's true or not, but it does at least speak to this willingness to really have a show of force that would send a strong message. And I'm sure, in places like Colombia, Cuba, and even Mexico, maybe not China and Russia, but certainly in Latin America, governments should be very, very worried. And the Trump administration has stated not only that Mexico is run by cartels, but that they have been ready to act on the information that they have and try to take care of the quote unquote take care of the problem themselves. So it'll be really interesting to see what that means moving forward. But I am guessing that governments in the region will be very careful in their interactions with the US because of this show of force.
I think that's right.
And
And the other funny thing I'll just throw in here, Gustav, because you're spot on about what I think other countries in the region will take away from all this. You can almost see the internal administration politics behind this, right? On the one hand, you have Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor, and I think Archivist of the United States, Marco Rubio, who has long been a kind of a second generation neoconservative seeking regime change, and J.D. Vance, someone who very much is skeptical of long-standing forever wars. And here we have the two of them kind of making common cause, almost in a perfect world of, I'm going to change the regime, something Rubio wants, but I'm not going to stick around and I'm not going to really try to transform this country, something Vance would want. And so if I'm sitting in a foreign country, particularly Mexico, Cuba, or others, I'm worried about this confluence of this coalition building inside the Trump administration because it can have real deleterious consequences for me.
yeah, and just to add to this too, so I said at the outset how costly this potentially could be over the medium to long term. But the key about this sort of operation is the cost, we will not feel the cost short in the short term. And so this represents potentially a very permissive environment to build on these sorts of operations. And I would be very worried if another leader kind of in our hemisphere right now, because I don't think that there will be political, economic, or human costs, right, that are kind of pushed upon the U.S. political system in the short term, right? I think we are in an environment where Trump just said this is possible, and they did this, and they could do it again quickly before they're experiencing any other cost to this. The one thing I'll add to this too that we haven't quite spoken to as well too is recognizing that when we talk about no cost in the short term, we are talking very much about in terms of US interests and US operators, but there is a real civilian cost. We see the death count from this limited operation in Venezuela already rising within that as well too. And I think we'll be remiss to forget about the human cost that these operations have, even if they don't escalate further. And so it's a further thing to worry about as we do this, because this was perhaps as kind of well run and as clean an operation as you could hope for. It's not clear that this would keep happening. And this was already pretty costly in terms of human life, as well as the human security of those that are in Venezuela as well, too, and right, are worried about what comes next.
Really important point, I think. When these things happen, I often think of the cost in soft power, right? In American soft power, but also sort of the what this does for, say, Americans traveling abroad and just Americans interactions with people in other countries who may now come to not only mistrust but even resent the United States because of these types of actions and what many people consider to be violations, clear violations of international law. So that's not particularly quantifiable, especially not in the short run. But it's something that I think would add to the cost that we're seeing of this operation. So we'll see whether there are additional costs of, we may be in limbo in which it could have been the worst. I don't know that necessarily that this is true, but it's the worst of both worlds in which you went in, you ousted the president of a sovereign country, and you didn't do more than that, in which you're not, to some extent, transforming some structures that would allow the opposition or other groups to really call for free and fair elections and have a this is not suggesting that the U.S. should have stayed in there, but it's almost like it could, you could end up in limbo as you maybe wouldn't have done anything, and that was one scenario, or you go in and you change enough, and that's another scenario. But this one in which you go in and change minimally, but really generate a lot of consequences around it. It'll be interesting to see whether that's the remedy is worse than the cure in some form, um, or the this. What's the
The cure
expression
is
of
worse
the?
than the disease. Yeah.
Thank you. The cure is
Yeah.
worse than the
Yeah.
disease.
But on that note, Gustavo, I mean, this kind of building on the whether we'll stay in this limbo. Kind of from your analysis earlier, that Venezuela is not a particularly high capacity state. There are high levels of corruption. If the U.S. goal is in fact to get access to more oil, what does that look like in terms of being stuck in this stage right now? What can are the existing institutions able to do this, even if they totally bend their back to United States interests and demands?
Yeah, that's a really weird question, and it sounds like it's something that would definitely take some time, right, to really build up that infrastructure and get Venezuelan extraction and production back up to where it needs to be for that oil to be meaningful. And currently, we see oil prices not moving much after the attack, and I think it's just an indication of how Venezuelan oil production has really dwindled over time over the last 15 years or so. But the reserves are there, and that's, I think, the White House's expectation. But you have one scenario in which you have some form of government that continues to oppress Venezuelans, but appeases U.S. interests and allows the extraction of oil or enough oil for the U.S. not to meddle in internal affairs. And I think that would be certainly disappointing to many Venezuelans, but perhaps more comforting for those on the U.S. side who may, um, I think, who just remember the really bad outcomes with attempts at nation building that we've seen in recent years.